Hey, Manuel here from New Work by Design. I had a really interesting discussion yesterday on one of the group calls for my transformation course about about the decision-making section, and the question was, well, what if there is a conflict between decisions on different levels of scope? Or to make it more explicit, let's say there is a decision on company level and a team would like a decision that falls outside or that conflicts with that decision on company level. What do you do with that? That's a very interesting issue and one that happens all the time. The general answer would be, well, decisions on a higher scope, they kind of create the playing field for decisions on a smaller scope. So if there's a decision on a company level, that kind of puts in the boundaries that defines the playing field for the decisions that a team can make. So they need to lay those decisions on team level need to be within the playing field that's set by the company. So two concrete examples for that to make it more easier to grasp what that means. So let's say on a company level, we decide to have an open floor plan. There is no dedicated desks anymore for people because lots of people working remote now and only come occasionally to the office. It's just not viable to have a dedicated desk for everyone, and also no dedicated team rooms. So, but a team might argue, well, we would like to have our own team room so we can have our board on the wall and we can have our stand-ups in front of it in peace, and we can actually close the door when we want to and just have focus time for ourselves. And that's clearly contradicting. And maybe a second example, let's say as a company we decide, we created spaces in our office now for team gatherings where teams that don't see each other that often, they can come together in the office to have a team gathering there. And where maybe before we had more team gatherings in offsite locations, now we offer to do that in the offices to actually make use of the space and to actually have some live in the office. But the team might argue, well, but we would like to do our team gatherings in an offsite location. And again, there's this conflict. So what I think is important here is that the goal of a decision on a company level, so the goals for the decision and the reasoning why it happened that way needs to be very clear, to be communicated to those teams who might argue for a different solution that lies outside that policy. So it needs to be, someone needs to be able to explain to that team why it makes sense on a company level to do it that way. And it's probably a trade-off, and it's also important to acknowledge that for them right now, that's an inconvenience and that's actually a downside for them. So you need to be able to explain, well, we understand that downside, and that is the trade-off. The downside you experience right now, that is the trade-off that we're making to reach this other goal that we're having with this decision. And that might be to save cost, to actually have some life in the office and so forth. But you need to be able to explain it and to explain that trade-off, and hopefully people get why that makes sense on a company level. They might still be disappointed that on their team scope right now, that means they can't do what would be best for them, but they hopefully understand why it's best for the company, and then they can accept, right, that makes sense. Having said that, I think in both of these cases, teams should be able to argue for an exception to that rule, to that policy. So let's say you have, in the example of where you say you have an open floor plan and there's no dedicated team spaces. Let's say you have a team that's actually co-located and that wants to be in the office 5 days a week together. So clearly the reasoning that most people work remotely and only come occasionally to the office is not valid for them. So in that case, I would say, of course, you should have your dedicated team space. If you actually use it on a daily basis and get the use out of it, then it still makes sense. Likewise, let's say for the team gathering policy to do them in the office, let's say that that team argues for, well, we would like to do our team gathering offsite because, you know, all the advantages of being offsite, having more focus, being away from the daily environment, not being distracted. That again makes a lot of sense for them. That isn't that wasn't the reasoning why we made this policy to have team gatherings in the office, because that was under the assumption that most people work remotely and don't see each other every day and don't spend every day in the office. So again, for them it might make sense to actually have an exception to the rule and do their team gatherings offsite. In order to discuss these exceptions, again, the goals of a decision and the reasoning for the specific decision that was made need to be very clear, because then you can actually argue, well, in your specific case, doing something different than the policy actually aligns more with those goals. So that needs to be very clear. And maybe one last thing, something to look out for. I mean, if teams argue a lot for these exceptions or argue a lot against a policy without, you know, actually being an exception that makes sense, that is more aligned with the goals behind the decision, there's probably not enough commitment for the decision on a company-wide level, and there needs to be some more involvement of the people who are affected to get this commitment to this company policy. All right, so that's all I want to share. So again, the question is, how do you deal with conflicts between decisions on different levels of scope? And that again happens all the time and is a tricky bit. I hope this video helps with dealing with those situations.